Hello and welcome to The Bull. My name is Lester Kiewit. I host Good Morning Cape Town on CapeTalk, and I'm joined by Tara Roos, who is a parliamentary researcher, political writer and analyst, and welcome to The Bull. The Bull is where we want to unpack South African politics, parliament, and also a little bit of South African pop culture. And Tara Roos, remind us who you are. I've given a brief introduction, but who is Tara Roos?
Hello, Cape Town and South Africa at large. I'm Tara. I am a political analyst. By day, I work in research, and then by night, I like to upset politicians on the internet by writing scathing articles about them. That's pretty much me.
That's what we're going to try and do with the Bull. But what else do we want to do with the Bull? Looking at the politics of the day, the impact of the parliamentary procedure, the protocol, but also the parliamentary performances, because it is the big theatre in South Africa, but also we'll also look at pop culture.
Pop culture is so important, and we need to appeal to all audiences in South Africa.
Appeal to the Gen Z, who are apparently so disaffected with politics.
And who don't want to vote. It's disheartening.
Okay, so let's start here. We're going to have a show in 3 segments. One with dealing with the politics of the day, then go into something interesting that happened on the parliamentary precinct. It could be something that happened in plenary, could be something that happened in a portfolio committee, or it could be one of the interesting questions that come up in questions to ministers in the executive. And then we'll look at a little bit of how that politics has been playing out in South African pop culture. So let's start here. The big news of the day at the moment is the legal challenge to the Employment Equity Amendment Act. It is an act that is going to give loose targets, sectoral targets in various industries to try and see further transformation in the South African workforce. We do have, going back to several Employment Equity Commission reports, that the demographics of particularly private sector South Africa, particularly in the mid to upper management, does not reflect the broad demographics of South African society. Let's start there. What does the Employment Equity Amendment Act want to do?
The overall aim of the Act currently is to look at that there is greater racial distribution amongst higher to upper level management in the private sector across the board. The DA's court case, it's a two-pronged argument. On one end, they're saying this is going against the equality clause of the Constitution. They're specifically looking at Section 15A of the Employment Equity Amendment Act to say this is contradicting the Constitution and we don't think this clause should be included. And what I think they might win on the basis of is the fact that they're saying this bill was incorrectly tagged in Parliament. So initially it did not go through the NCOP, and because the DA is saying you need to factor in provincial targets, it needs to go through the NCOP, and therefore legislatively we need to go back to the drawing board. The interesting argument now, and we've seen this with a few bills in the GNU, we saw this with NHI, we saw this with Bella, is that the DA, now that they hold more political power within government, are challenging the ANC's previous acts from the 6 administrations that was already voted on and passed in a way that they have never before, because they hold more political power and because it is not an ANC-led majority. Do I think the DA could win this court case? I don't think that they could successfully prove that the Employment Equity Amendment Act goes against the equality clause. I don't think that there's a basis for that.
Because the Constitution, while there is the equality clause, the Constitution also allows of what's known as mechanisms of redress. So yes, everyone is equal before the law. No to discrimination based on race, gender, ethnic background, but noting our history and our past in South Africa, brought on by 300 years of colonialism and apartheid. The Constitution does allow for mechanisms like employment equity and like affirmative action.
And I do think that there's a larger conversation to be had about BEE as a whole, and the manner in which I think the DA is going about it, I think, is completely incorrect for the aim that they're trying to achieve. Because I do think that there is an argument to be made that BEE has not been effective in its current form. And I think that is a separate conversation. Legislatively, I do think that the DA has grounds. I do think it brings in an interesting conversation about how far the Democratic Alliance is willing to go within the GNU to overturn previously ANC passed and signed in policies now that there is no longer an ANC majority. Because, I mean, we saw this with the VAT debacle as well. They also went to court. They're back in court again. I think that this is going to be a reoccurring trend, especially with land expropriation. That was also another act that they were challenging. I do think that it puts in an interesting dynamic, especially within the GNU, to say, we're in a coalition together, but I'm taking you to court over an act that you had already voted on, signed and passed, and now we're still going to government together.
Because the amendments, the procedure from policy paper to voting in the National Assembly and NCOP and then signed into law by the president, it's over a period of 10 years now. This isn't a new bill that gets foisted upon.
And I think it's an interesting question. Would the DA be in court regarding this amendment if the ANC still had a ruling majority? Are they there out of a point of principle to say, we truly believe that this bill was being incorrectly tagged and therefore it should go to court and go back to the drawing board? Or are they just doing this because now they think that they somewhat have a fighting chance?
Just looking at what this Amendment Act looks like. Look, we do have an employment equity legislative framework already that said that if you're a business of more than 50 people, you need to align with certain targets that don't necessarily look at national demographics, but look at provincial and local demographics. We've had that before, but what this Amendment Act does, it puts punitive measures. If you don't adhere to that, there is a certain fines that you could pay, maybe even deregistering of businesses at its complete extent. So this is just adding a stick instead of a carrot that has been used before.
So employment equity, as it currently stands and how it is legislated, is that you get a BE rating depending on how many at your top level management, how many black employees you have on a various board or holding senior positions within a company. You get a specific score, and often it was that companies would only partner with other companies that had favorable BE scores. The conversation at large, and what I think the DA specifically is missing from their argument, is that BE currently, I don't personally feel, has been an effective form of economic redress. I think that it has allowed a small minority of well politically connected black elites to pervade into the private sector in a manner that has not been redistributive for at large South Africa. And I think that that is what is currently missing from the DA's argument, because they're almost grandstanding in a manner that we often see in America when they talk about affirmative action. Like I've seen their national spokesperson tweet out, I don't want to be given a job because I'm a woman and because I'm black. I want to be given it on the basis of merit. And that's not what the Employment Equity Act Amendment is saying. What they're saying is that there should be specific quotas in order to mitigate what we are currently seeing.
Wait, stop right there. What's the difference between a quota and a target?
So a quota means you have to meet this specifically. A target is... I'm trying to explain this very simply.
A target is an ideal to reach for, and also what it says in that, look, there are ways that if you can't find someone who is suitably qualified that needs to meet a certain demographic, you can look elsewhere. If you're unable to meet these targets, you could write to the minister to say and give reasons. I've looked everywhere. There's no one that meets these qualifications except this person who is maybe overprescribed in this industry. For example, a white South African man. And then the minister could say, well, yes, fine, actually, carry on.
And that's the thing about the bill, is that there's this big misconflation that the government is saying, you are not allowed to employ more than 15 white people, as an example, at this particular company. And that's not what the act legislatively says. But I think there's often this idea of white fear amongst certain South Africans, is that white people are now going to become the most marginalized and they are going to be pushed out of South Africa as a whole. And that just simply isn't happening. And I do think that legislatively, I don't think this bill is the best. I don't think that it attacks the root cause of vast disparities between our Gini coefficients. But I do think that the DA has a case, especially with the bill being tagged incorrectly. I do think that there was a major misstep. I don't think that they would be in court if we were sitting with an ANC ruling majority, because even if the bill was incorrectly tagged, we would have gone through the processes again, and it would have still been passed. The likelihood that this bill wasn't going to get passed if it had gone through the NCOP is non-existent. The bill would have passed. No amount of, and I mean, it is quite sad to say, but even if at large, I think that there was distress from the country and distaste for the bill at public hearings, had they have happened, it would have still passed because it was an ANC legislation.
Look, I largely agree with you that if you address education, if you address the issues that affect education, like health and nutrition for young children, already foundation phase, builds a foundation for learning well into matric, post-schooling. If you deal with gender imbalances, if you deal with post-funding finances like NSFAS, you bring more and more people who are qualified into position. So I agree with you. We also have to deal with the root cause here of finding suitably qualified people and making sure they go through a schooling system well equipped to study further and to go into these positions. But we're not having that at the moment.
And I think for a lot of South Africans, and this is the big issue, I think, when we make legislation too party political, is that the conversation about economic redress is being completely missed. And now it's an issue of, are you for affirmative action or are you against it? And that's not the conversation we should be having. The conversation we should be having is this piece of legislation going to actively work towards what we think the ideal South Africa should be? And if, depending on whether you stand on that answer, then look at the bill at large and say, how can we better adjust this? But now it's almost become, and this is a big problem, is that I think often not just political parties, but their supporters want to make everything completely black and white. And this isn't a black and white conversation, is that, you know, we can interpret the bill in a specific manner, but whether or not it is going to be effective is what we need to be looking at.
Well, let's talk about the black and white conversation. If we look at the demographics of this country, and I'm going to use the broadly black, Biko-black description of what a black person is, we're talking of a population of 92% in South Africa, were black people. If you're looking at the 4.5 million white South Africans who contribute to an overall population of 62 million South Africans, that is a representation of 6.5% of the country. If we had 100 people in South Africa, it means that 92 of those 100 would be black. It would mean that 2 of those would be what you'd call Asian South Africans, and then you'd have 6 white people there. That's what a makeup of South Africa looks like, distilled into 100 people. But our workspaces, particularly middle and upper management, does not reflect the demographics of South Africa. So we also have to ask, are we completely colorblind? Or do we address that we live in a country that is an overwhelming majority black country? Our corporate spaces doesn't look like that.
I agree. But I don't think that the way in which you adjust that is now taking the act further, and because the act hasn't worked. Retrospectively, since BEE has been instituted, demographically, companies have hit certain targets, and that has been wonderful and lovely. But at large, trickle-down economics doesn't work. That money has not been distributed where it has been needed most. And I agree with the idea that, you know, when we look at, specifically in the corporate private sector, it is still largely white, it is still largely male. But the way you address that is not saying, okay, now we are going to require companies to meet these targets because otherwise they will be fined or they will be non-favorable when it comes to receiving government tenders, because then you do not open up the floor for people to enter those spaces on a basis of merit in a manner that allows everyone to compete fairly. What we will then see is what a heightened version of what we see now is that a group of well-connected people politically and economically are going to benefit from this act in a manner that does not help South Africans at large.
We also have to draw the distinction. There's a difference between employment equity and brought Placeback economic
Yeah.
empowerment. These two sound familiar, sound similar.
They're not the same.
They're not the same ideas.
And what I would rather like to see, instead of an extension of BEE in the current form when we're looking at employment equity, is how are we going to increase education at a basic level? Because when we look at South Africa 30 years on from the apartheid era, the reason why these corporate spaces are still largely white and still largely male is because those are the demographics and the groupings of people who were previously advantaged and were able to pass on their inherited privileges onto their kids, who then pass it on to their kids, who then pass it on to their kids. So you cannot suddenly come in 30 years later and say, okay, we're going to put this Band-Aid on this gaping hole. It just simply doesn't work.
Yeah, I've was explained in order to explain South Africa's transition to an American with the 49 South African resettlers to the United States. South Africa underwent a miracle. We had a political revolution where political power was transferred from a white minority to a black majority. What has not happened is the transfer of an economy. What was decided upon is a slow but steady transfer and transformation of the economy to reflect South African demographics. For many people, that, while bloodless, has happened too slow, and we're bearing the fruits of that slow, that I think was intentionally slow process of, yes, we have political power, but we're going to wait for the sun to set before we slowly, not to cause too much ructions within local industry, international markets, but slowly but surely we will transform the economy. That, of course, has not happened quickly enough for what the 800,000 mostly black job seekers who enter the South African job market every year.
I do think that it has been an extremely slow process. And, I will say this. Thabo Mbeki was probably, I think, my favorite South African president. HIV, 300,000 people dying aside. That was a tragedy.
There's always that caveat. You always have to say he's great guy.
He was amazing.
300,000 people died.
Except that the 300,000 people that died. But I do think, especially in the Mbeki presidency, because, look, Nelson Mandela was all about we need political stability. And while I think that Thabo Mbeki, people call him the father of the middle class. He really came out with these robust economic development mechanisms. And while I think those were important, something that South Africa critically missed out, especially in the early 2010s, was economic redress. And I do think that now with these kind of large scale legislative band-aids, I call them, that you are trying to fill these gaping holes, the fact that we did not have economic redress to start with and then build that up legislatively, I think is we are now seeing the cracks in the system of democratic South Africa.
Yeah, before I go into the technicalities of the DA's case and what tagging mechanisms are, just as an aside on favorite presidents. So Cyril Ramaphosa is often painted as this liberal pro-business darling. But if you look at Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency, available that fortifies the access of children to go to school and not have language be a barrier. If you look at Cyril Ramaphosa and the expropriation bill, that does forward the cause of land redress. If you look at the Cyril Ramaphosa, whose administration goes to the ICJ and takes Israel to court in the defense of Palestinians and Gazans, that is a particularly progressive and, dare I say, left-leaning president. I don't know where people sometimes get off saying that Cyril Ramaphosa has been neoliberal and pro-business.
I think I will say this. Cyril Ramaphosa has to deal, out of all of our presidents, he's dealt with the most politically. If you think about his transition into power, if you think about the pandemic, the fact that he lived through that and guided South Africa through that, all the legislative challenges coming out of state capture, now going into a GNU, I don't think any president has faced the political terrain like Cyril. And I don't want to speak too soon, but the fact that he came back for a second term, we haven't had a motion of no confidence pass against him. Like, I mean, he could be the first South African president to sit 2 full terms, and I think that could be likely. My issue with Cyril, and I think that there's a distinction between party leader Cyril Ramaphosa and President Cyril Ramaphosa. I do think that at large, as a president, he's done a good job. I think that he was faced with a really difficult set of circumstances. But I do think in terms of the ANC and where the ANC sees itself that he is on, I don't think that he is what they fully envision as an ANC president and leader.
And look, a lot of those criticisms would be coming from people who historically would have been ANC aligned. Now they're called EFF and the MK Party. But back to the Employment Equity Amendment Act, you say that this case for the DA could weigh on technicalities, that incorrectly explained what the tagging mechanism is and why the DA says this is a bill that should have had the voice of more provinces, the provincial voice, and why it's not just an ordinary bill that can be passed by a committee through the National Assembly, passed by the NCOP, signed by the President. There's 2 different ways in which bills become laws.
Yes. So there are 2 main tags in Parliament. You get a Section 75 bill and a Section 76 bill. And what the DA is saying is that the bill was incorrectly tagged because it looks at provincial populations and how that needs to affect racial targets for the new extension of the Employment Equity Act. However, the bill did not go through the National Council of Provinces. So traditionally, when often South Africans think about a piece of legislation, is that it's introduced, it goes to committee, from committee it goes to the National Assembly, it's debated, it's voted on, then goes to the NCOP, then goes to the President, then signed into law. This is a very long and lengthy process. On average, it takes about a bill from writing it to the President signing it. We're looking at an average 2.5 to 3 years. So legislatively, this has been an extensive process. However, the DA has not brought up this tagging issue until now. When the bill was in the National Assembly, they never brought up the fact that it was incorrectly tagged. Before the President signed it, this never happened. While it was in committee, they have never raised the fact that this bill has been incorrectly tagged until it had been signed into law, and up until the GNU was formed, the ANC had dropped below 50, and now they're bringing this issue up. Do I think that the bill should have gone through the NCOP? Procedurally, yes. Do I think it would have made a difference? Absolutely not. The bill would have still passed. Do I think at large there is a public disdain for the bill that had public hearings been held, it would have been a larger national conversation? No. I think that South Africans at large are very receptive to employment equity, and the DA represents but a small minority of voices who are in disagreement with it. However, the bill was incorrectly tagged. If it goes back to Parliament, will it get passed again? I don't think so.
And what's significant about that is because it is legislation that affects provinces, it's an act that speaks to provincial and local demographics, and therefore the argument is because it's affecting provinces and people in provinces, it should have been taken for public comment in our provinces. Okay, I'm glad that you've raised that. Let's move on now and talk about the engine room of Parliament, and that is the committees. When people are usually tuning into Parliamentary Channel 408, it's about what has been said in a National Assembly.
Yeah.
It's whether who is on the platform and who is shouting at who from across the aisle. There's been a greater focus on committees these days. One being one of the side effects, the positive side effects of COVID and the lockdown. Everything went remote. So committees, many of them sit and it's streamed out to the world on Parliament's YouTube channel. It gives now MPs another opportunity to market themselves. So political parties are increasingly using video, the social media platforms to, yes, engage with the public, but also to say, hey, look at me.
You know, I remember growing up and watching Parliament on TV, like on DSTV, and I think that was such a quintessential thing, like growing up in the early 2000s, is especially during the Zoomer years, it was like a form of entertainment, and it's really one of the many ways in which I think I was politically engaged from a young age. And we see that now, like transferring onto social media. A lot of committees online, people don't watch Parliament on TV anymore, they watch it on YouTube. And they see a lot of these clips getting reposted on TikTok, a lot on Twitter. the issue, and the Daily Maverick did a full-on investigation into this, is that political parties are now paying influencers to promote content about their political party. So this all started with the VAT increase, where legislatively, we all knew it was a DA win. We knew when the DA took their case to court, they were the only people, because Action SA's recommendation was non-legally binding. They were never going to stop the VAT increase, no matter what they were saying. But if you had logged onto Twitter during this time, people in droves were thanking Action SA. The Action SA social media cards were everywhere. You would have thought the way Action SA had been parading that they had actually done something. They had done nothing. But the Daily Maverick had done a full-on investigation into show how they are alleging that Action SA had paid influencers to promote their content because they had reached out asking what the processes were to have something being promoted, and they used Action SA as an example to say, oh, we paid this is something that we've done, and this is a successful campaign that we've done. I know from personal experience, and people in the political world who work behind the scenes and who are staffers, we all know that there's a lot of things about political parties that are fake. They bus people into their stadiums. They bring people to their rallies.
All political parties.
All political parties do that. And it is all a show. A lot. Like, if you had every single political party just put out a message to say, we are having a protest or a gathering or a meeting at this time, and they put in no effort to actively bring people there, very few people would show up. And it is about show. The issue I have with social media is that it almost creates an echo chamber silo. And we saw this a lot, specifically with the EFF in the election. If you had logged onto social media, like in the run up to the 2024 election, the EFF was absolutely everywhere. People were almost like EFF enthused. And a lot of people thought that the EFF was going to do a lot better than they actually did. But that's because the noise had only existed on social media. Similarly, with Action SA and looking at how they had handled their VAT recommendation to National Treasury, when you logged onto social media, you thought Action SA, they were running this case and they were going to be the ones who stopped VAT. But if you had to walk onto the street and ask someone what Action SA had done in Parliament, no one would be able to tell you. And that is the issue, is that we lack a lot of discernment, I think, as the South African public, specifically as young South Africans. I think there's an argument to be made that by paying influencers to promote what is essentially fake news and fake hype, that you are actively disengaging South Africans and giving them a false sense of conflation about a political party's actual influence.
What is wrong with, and let's park influences for a second, but what's wrong with a political party writing a zinger of a speech in 40-second sound bites that are put together, because they know the attention span of the South African public doesn't go beyond 40 seconds. They know that particularly younger voters engage via TikTok and videos that can be uploaded to Twitter. What is wrong with that messaging? I think it's pretty good politics to reach an audience that may not necessarily going to watch an entire parliamentary debate or listen through an entire portfolio committee meeting.
I think that there's a fine line between trying to engage an audience and actively participating in deception. And all political parties are deceptive, but I think that there are levels and degrees towards deception. A lot of people, I think, don't know this, but a lot of analysts, commentators, they consult with these various political parties, they work for these political parties. A lot of journalists, people, like prominent figures on social media, are on these political parties' payroll. And even if it is just one retweet, something saying, like, this sounds like a good idea. And there's
what does it say about me? I've not been approached at all.
You've not been approached.
I haven't gotten a check.
Have you not gotten a check? I haven't either. But it's a common thing in politics and in the political world, is that people you see on TV, people you see on Twitter, on social media, they're getting checks from these political parties. They're not saying, oh, this actually is a good point because out of their own volition. It's because they have a following and because people will listen to their ideas. I do think that there is a fine line between spreading your political party's message and participating in trying to deceive the public, particularly because I don't think that it works. I think, especially with the kind of new age branding and the new political parties, I think that there's a large emphasis on playing the media game. And playing the media game is important, But what matters is interactions with South Africans on the ground. And I do think that there is a large conflation between winning like the social media war, which a lot of political parties are trying to do, and actually getting votes. Because those two things are vastly different. Because all these influencers that they're paying, they're not going to vote for them. They're not voting for these political parties. Or, like, someone can like your tweets, but just because they like your tweets doesn't mean they're going to vote for you.
So where's the best social media game at the moment?
This is a difficult question. I think, for a long time, I thought the EFF was, like, they played the social media game really well. Like, every statement that they wrote was punchy, like, the way that, and I do think that's largely because of the way Floyd had run the communication structures within the EFF. I do think that has transferred onto MK. My issue is I think MK as a party plays the media game well. The individuals within MK and the way they communicate to the public and the press, that doesn't work. I do think that that MK absorbing Darian Camper into their ranks, that was a good move because, I mean, he's a researcher, but he is like a de facto almost spokesperson for MK now. That was a good game. The DA plays the traditional media game really well. I think they had a good statement. Their leaders write good op-eds. They appeal to a certain demographic really well. The new age political parties, I do struggle to take them seriously. I think I used to have a lot of respect for Action SA and the way they had handled their communication strategy. I do think that it has gone down the drain. I will say this. I used to have a lot of respect for Herman Mashaba, but I can take no one seriously who tweets about themselves in the third person. Like, I don't know why their comms director has not taken his Twitter login details away from him.
Talk about Twitter login details. What do you say about this particular account?
Have you seen my wife?
Helen Zilla
It's on TikTok.
Helen Zilla on TikTok.
I'm sure her intern runs that. I don't think it's her. Like, I'm sure she has like a 20-year-old social media intern who's posting the TikToks for her. I think that there's a difference between Helen and Herman, though. Because Helen Zilla, she's very much like, she's become like an enigmatic, like, political figure in the sense that she's there, but she's not there. Whereas, like, Herman Mashaba actively thinks he's going to be president. And so that's the difference.
No, but it's complete pandering.
No, it is pandering.
I'll play you another one.
Yo, what's up?
Oh.
On this beautiful day.
Yo, what's up? Musi Maimani, yo, what's up?
They're all trying to do it, and it's not working. It's tinge.
I say good day. I say good day, fellow kids.
It is. It's like your dad getting on social media, trying to relate to the youth. And it's like, they don't want that.
Do you know who does it well? Ati Gileba.
Yes.
The president's social media person is excellent because it's very little of political messaging, but it is harmonizing this message that, yes, he may be a billionaire, but he is a president and he's a people's president. And you know what? He is your awkward dad, but he's lovable. And so she's normalized this the nickname of Cupcake. To the extent where people, if they see Cyril Ramaphosa in public, they're taking out their phones and they say, "Hello, Cupcake," and he will respond. So I think Ati Gileba
she does a good job at humanizing Cyril in a manner that we have never seen before. She humanizes the president to a manner that we see, you know what, he is just a human being. I actually have a funny story about that. So in another life, when I used to work in international relations, I was one of the South African youth delegates who went to COP. And so Cyril, Ati posted a specific TikTok video, I think it's still on the internet, of when Cyril fell asleep during the COP28 plenary. And we were all sitting there as the youth delegation being like, oh my God, no, why is he asleep? But it's those funny moments like that get hits on social media, that because his political presence has been so established, it humanizes him. The issue that I have with almost the kind of newcomers into the political game is that they're trying to be too relatable, where it's, please, you're still a politician, respect yourself. There is no need to get on the internet and to post memes and funny pictures and try and be cool, fun, quirky. Do your job. Do your job.
I'm struggling to find it now, but there's a video, and at his TikTok page of at the Union Buildings and Cyril Ramaphosa hiding behind a pillar. And this is all natural because it's a gaggle of journalists and Cyril Ramaphosa taking a photograph of them and she captures that and it's like, oh, Dan! That's what it gives. So it humanizes the president. So that's the social media influence on political parties. Let's move on as politicians, as influencers themselves. Recently, we have had more, shall we call it, grandstanding, showboating within committee, looking at MPs from the DA, Liam Jacobs. You also had a Patriotic Alliance.
Ashley Sauls,
Ashley Sauls as well. So they have been in the pop culture realm, in the social media realm, create a bit of a name for themselves because, gosh, like it's never happened before. Holding entities account. And I don't know if this is... So what happens is, because it's on YouTube, committee meetings are recorded. And yes, I'll give them credit. Tough questions asked of public entities and individuals who come before committee, but you can almost see checking, is the camera on?
Yeah.
Cool, let me ask my question. My problem is the response that it gets from social media as if it's the first time tough questions have been asked in committee. And yes, I'll accept, we have new people born every day, new people becoming aware of institutions like Parliament. But they're really riding the wave of social media and greater focus on what happens in committees.
The issue I have specifically with the Liam Jacobs incident, firstly, I do think that there is a fine line between asking hard questions and being disrespectful, and I think that he was disrespectful. And this is my personal opinion, I think that especially in the line of questioning, he could have given that woman from Netball South Africa an opportunity to answer the questions. And, and like this almost snarky level remarks just say, you should have done your homework, you should have brought your responses here.
Especially if the argument was, we're a new governance structure, we've just arrived in this position. Yes, there is a record and a financial statement of the previous financial year. We haven't had chance to interrogate every line item, and that would have been, I think, a sufficient response to say, we're new here and give us some time. But of course, when there's blood in the water, you pounce.
And corruption is a large-scale problem in South Africa. There is corruption that happens at every level in every government entity, and those issues need to be addressed. But Liam was not there and asking those specific lines of questions because he actually cares about where the money in Netball South Africa has gone. Because if he wanted to take it further, or he would have gone to the Special Investigating Unit, he would have written to the Auditor General, he would have tabled a motion in committee. There are so many legislative mechanisms that you could use specifically as a member of Parliament to make sure that this issue gets judged further than like a 5-second clip that gets reposted to TikTok. And again, I relate this back. I do think that we lose a lot of political nuance, specifically as the South African public, to say, this is the first time you see someone asking hard questions, but hard questions are being asked. This is not something new. Liam Jacobs is not the first MP to ask a difficult question in committee. He definitely won't be the last. But there's almost the question we need to be asking ourselves, specifically, is this what Gen Z in South African politics is going to be like? Right now, there are only two members of Parliament who are under 25. So it's Liam Jacobs and Jasmine Peterson. Cleo, from the PA, she was the youngest, but she's now left. So there's only 2 MPs under 25. Jasmine, I mean, I've been in committee with her and like I've observed her. She takes a very different approach to Liam. But I think the question is, would he have asked that same questions had the cameras not been rolling in the same manner? The answer is no, because he didn't do it because he felt that this was the most pressing issue that he felt South Africans needed answers for. He did it because he wanted likes on TikTok.
How are we to know his motives? I've seen the rest of his social media, and he goes on the parliamentary oversight visits to empty fields where multi-million rand sports centres were supposed to have been built, and he's sometimes sardonic, humorous reactions to there being absolutely a pile of rubble where there should be a multi-purpose centre being built is probably the same reaction that normal South Africans would have.
It is a normal reaction, but the difference is that as a member of parliament, Liam has the capabilities to take that further. Out of all the oversight visits that he has, other than giving a speech in committee or during a plenary, what actionable steps has he taken to make sure that there has been an ongoing investigation, that these issues are looked into further other than a funny TikTok video?
Is there now a pipeline from social media to politics? I'm familiar, and I receive Darian Camper's work quite well, and this is before he was a researcher for the MK party. Being a parliamentary researcher, with much respect to all parliamentary researchers, important job, but not a high-profile job. And when he was appointed, was announced, almost like it was an announcement of a football player joining another team, that he would be a parliamentary researcher. My thoughts was, it's just a parliamentary researcher, but still creating a political name for himself in this pipeline from social media influencer. I use that very loosely. Influencer, pundit, social media pundit, to politician.
I do think that there is a growing pipeline, and following Darian transitioning into MK, I think now that you do see almost an influx of people on social media trying to do the Darian Camper-esque takedown style videos, who I would not be shocked have political aspirations come 26, 27, and even in 29. I do think that Darian Camper will become a member of parliament in 2029 if MK is still around. My big issue with the Darian Camper situation is, firstly, he did not make the announcement timeously. He knew he was going to be a parliamentary researcher. He knew that this was going to happen. It wasn't a decision that was made overnight. I do think that it was an extremely smart decision from MK's perspective to say, you know what, we see someone who has a large social media following, whose politics closely aligns with ours, and we see an opportunity here. I would have had a lot more respect for Darian Camper had he joined the EFF. And I know that this is because, he had campaigned for the EFF all along, but the fact that he joined MK, I do think that it was motivated by political grifting, but more than anything else. I don't think that there was an argument to be made that he felt, and I don't know him as a person, I don't know his intentions, but I struggle to believe that he felt so emotionally compelled by the message of MK to join MK had MK not gotten 14% in the last national election.
I think recruitment, or should I say the lack of recruitment from a party like the ANC has led to its governance failures. And hear me out here. So the DA actively goes out and recruits.
Yeah.
I know of people
Me too.
who say, I've been called by the DA, who has asked me, do you want to be an MP? Because these are people who have a particular role in society, maybe within business. I know of doctors who have joined the DA, but no ideological policy symmetry. DA just calls him, do you want to be an MP? The DA goes out and recruits particularly young people to work in parliament, work in metros, work in provinces. The ANC, on the other hand, remember, Mangahong, they instituted the rule. You have to be part of the ANC's NEC for 10 years. You have to be a member of the ANC for 10 years before you can join the ANC.
Yeah.
Which means if you get your ANC card at 18 years old, you would have to be actively part of the party till you're 28 before you could even be considered for a senior position within the ANC. And you know what? Young people decide, I'm going to leave the ANC because there's no... The EFF attracts young people in the droves. MK says, there's a great smart guy on social media. Let's attract him. So then the question is, shouldn't smart, well-read, good communicators be part of political formations if they have small, large following on social media? I think it's open game. I think it's fair game.
I think that it's fair game, but I do think that there is a line of honesty in which you need to be transparent with your audience.
You saying politicians need to be honest?
I think that we need accountability on all fronts. I think this is the issue that I have. You cannot be someone who calls out the political establishment and say, I don't agree with these political practices, but then decide to play the political game when it benefits you. And that's what I think the difference is that when you watch Darren's content prior to him joining MK, and he had known for a good couple of months that this was a conversation that he was having, that he was most likely going to take this job. He knew when the medium-term budget came out, he was already working for MK because he had received a copy, like a physical copy of the budget. You only get those when you work in Parliament. You only get those books when you are actively part of a political party. Like, the members of the public cannot just go and pick those books up. So he was already there when the medium-term budget came out. And I remember he had made a video on social media to be like, oh, don't ask where I got this. And it's like, we know internally. I was like, sir, I've seen you in the parliamentary precinct. Like, what are you talking about? But the fact that he isn't honest with his audience, it draws the line because, and this is the issue between like journalists and influencers, is that journalists are held to a standard of journalistic integrity. Anyone can get on the internet now and claim that they're a political analyst or that they're a journalist. And I think it tarnishes the name of people who are doing real hard work.
I'm telling you, the documents aren't hard to find online. From me, Lester Kiewit, and a smart, well-read communicator who has no interest in politics.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on the
Thank
first episode
you.
of The Bull. We'll chat to you next time. Hope you have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.